It happened on a quiet afternoon, the kind that should have passed without trouble. But trouble doesn't ask for permission, and corruption never sleeps. A young boy, barely 13 years old, was riding a small dirt bike on an empty stretch of road, the wind in his hair and freedom in his smile. He didn't know that a shadow had been waiting for him, a sheriff with a badge that meant power, and a heart that had long forgotten what justice truly was. When the sheriff stopped him, the boy thought it was just a routine check. But what happened next would ignite a storm that no badge could silence. Witnesses said they saw the sheriff grabbing the boy by the arm, dragging him off the bike with unnecessary force. They heard the raised voice, the insults, the fury that made no sense for a harmless kid. And then came the strike, the blow that knocked the boy to the ground, leaving him shaken, bruised, and too scared to understand why this was happening. The sheriff walked away like nothing mattered, leaving the child alone on the side of the road. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly predict, was that the boy wasn't just any local kid. He was the son of a biker. By the time the boy stumbled home, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows that made the bruises on his face appear even darker. His father froze when he saw him. The world around him seemed to fall silent, as if holding its breath. The boy's trembling voice cracked as he recounted every detail: the badge, the anger, the strike, the humiliation. And as he spoke, something inside his father shifted. A calm, cold fury began to rise, the kind that only comes from love and injustice colliding. He didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't break anything. He simply said 4 words: "Tell me who did." Word travels fast in small towns, but it travels even faster through the veins of a biker brotherhood. Within 1 hour, the message spread across highways, bars, garages, and backroads. Within 2 hours, engines began to roar like thunder rolling in from every direction. And before the night fully took over the sky, dozens of motorcycles lined up in front of the boy's house. Riders who considered each other brothers, and who treated harm against one of their own like harm against themselves. None of them needed an explanation. The boy's broken voice and the father's steady rage told them everything. And as the engines rumbled low, as the night grew thicker, and as the truth settled heavily over them all, a single question remained, one that would soon echo through every corner of that corrupt sheriff's world. What happens when a man with a badge forgets his duty, and the wrong belonged to a brotherhood that never lets injustice go unanswered? Night fell over the small town with an unusual heaviness, as if the air itself sensed what was coming. The boy sat silently on the couch, his small hands trembling as the bikers examined the bruises along his cheek and arms. Every man in that room felt something ignite inside him, a mix of anger, loyalty, and a deep, protective instinct that ran through their blood like fire. The father knelt in front of his son, brushing dirt from the boy's hair with gentle fingers that contrasted sharply with the storm rising in his chest. He whispered, "You're safe now." But the flicker in his eyes revealed that safety was no longer enough. Justice had become the only acceptable answer. Bear, the club's president, paced the room with slow, controlled steps. He wasn't a man easily shaken, but seeing a child left beaten by the very person sworn to protect him awakened memories he thought he had buried. The sheriff had crossed a line, not just legally, but morally. And in the Brotherhood's world, lines like that were carved in stone. When Bear finally stopped pacing, the room stilled. He looked at the father, then at the boy, then at every man present. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of unbreakable conviction. No one touches a child. Not ever. We make this right. Outside, the rumble of engines grew as more bikers arrived, alerted by calls, messages, and instinct. Within moments, the street filled with headlights glowing like watchful eyes. Neighbors peeked through curtains, sensing that something monumental was unraveling. The bikers formed a silent perimeter around the house, creating a protective circle that felt less like a gathering and more like a vow. The father stepped outside, met by nods of solidarity, each one a promise that he wouldn't carry this burden alone. While the men discussed their next move, the boy slipped outside and stood beside his father, gripping his hand tightly. The bikers softened instantly at the sight, lowering their shoulders and offering warm smiles. One of them crouched down, looking the boy in the eyes. "We're here for you," he said gently. "Nothing's going to happen to you again." The child nodded, his trust slowly returning as he stood surrounded by men who treated him like he mattered. Because to them, he did. As the night deepened, the bikers gathered around the father, forming a circle that radiated loyalty, purpose, and unity. They discussed the sheriff, a man who had long abused his badge, a man protected by fear and silence. But fear didn't live here tonight. Not with engines echoing across the street. Not with a brotherhood fueled by justice. Their plan wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. And when truth is guarded by men who refuse to bend, it becomes a force more powerful than corruption ever imagined. The next morning, the town woke to a sight no one could ignore. Dozens of bikes parked in front of the sheriff's station, lined up with precision like steel soldiers awaiting command. The sun glinted off chrome and metal, casting reflections that seemed almost symbolic, light shining on a truth too long hidden. People gathered on sidewalks, whispering, pointing, watching as the bikers stood firm, their posture calm but unyielding. This wasn't chaos. This was confrontation with purpose. Inside the station, Sheriff Dalton watched from behind his blinds, jaw clenched, knuckles white against the window frame. He had expected the boy's father to complain, maybe even shout, but he had not expected the entire brotherhood to show up. He underestimated the bond these men shared, underestimated how far they would go to protect their own. As panic crept up his spine, Dalton straightened his uniform, attempting to regain the authority he thought the badge gave him. But deep down, he knew that badge had lost its meaning the moment he lifted his hand against the child. Bear stepped forward, knocking once on the station door. Not loud, not aggressive, just firm. A deputy opened it hesitantly, eyes darting between the bikers and his corrupt superior. Bear didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "We're here for the truth," he said, his tone calm like the silence before a storm. "And for accountability." The deputy swallowed hard, sensing the gravity of the moment. This wasn't a mob. This wasn't intimidation. This was justice knocking at a door that had been locked for far too long. The father stood beside Bear, holding a folder filled with witness statements and photos of the boy's injuries. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of standing up to a man who had terrorized the community for years. When Dalton finally stepped into the lobby, the tension thickened. The sheriff forced a smirk, attempting to belittle the group. "You people think you can storm in here and accuse me," he spat. But the words fell flat. The bikers didn't react. Their silence was louder than any threat. Bear took one step closer, eyes locked on Dalton's. "We don't accuse," he said. "We prove." And as he laid the folder on the counter, the sheriff watched his world begin to crumble. Not because of violence, but because the truth, backed by the strength of a brotherhood united, had finally arrived at his doorstep. The bikers didn't have to raise their voices. Their presence alone spoke the message clearly. This time, corruption wouldn't win. Sheriff Dalton's smirk faltered the moment he opened the folder. Bruises, angles, dates, statements from townspeople who had seen more than he realized. Suddenly, the room felt smaller, the fluorescent lights harsher. His badge, once a symbol of unquestioned authority, now weighed on his chest like a guilty verdict. He snapped the folder shut, trying to regain control. "This is all fabricated," he said, voice trembling ever so slightly. But the father stepped forward, eyes flooded not with fear, but with a clarity sharpened by love. "My son doesn't lie," he said quietly, "and neither do the people you've hurt." The deputies shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away, ashamed. Others stared at Dalton with hesitation that bordered on doubt. Bear observed it all with calculated calm. He didn't need to intimidate the sheriff. The truth was doing that on its own. "We're not here to fight," Bear said, his voice steady enough to calm a storm. "We're here to make sure this doesn't get buried." Dalton scoffed, but his eyes betrayed him. He was trapped, cornered not by fists or fury, but by unity, a force far more powerful than intimidation. One deputy, younger and earnest, stepped forward. His voice was soft, but determined. "Sheriff, I saw the boy. Those injuries weren't from a fall." Dalton snapped toward him, rage darkening his expression. "Watch yourself," he warned. But the deputy held firm, emboldened by the presence of men who refused to bow to corruption. The room shifted. Allegiances began to tilt. The sheriff realized too late that fear, his greatest weapon, was no longer effective. Not today. Not with this crowd. The father placed a photo on the counter, sliding it toward Dalton like a final truth he couldn't escape. The bruises across the child's face were unmistakable. Small, fresh, undeniably inflicted by an adult hand. Dalton's eyes flickered, his breath shallow. For the first time, he wasn't looking at bikers or rebels. He was looking at the consequences of his own cruelty. Behind the group, townspeople pressed closer to the windows, watching the man who had long ruled with intimidation now crumble under the weight of accountability. Bear leaned forward, his voice soft enough to be calm, but sharp enough to pierce. "You thought no one would stand up to you," he said. "But you hurt a child, and that's where your power ends." Dalton opened his mouth to retaliate, but no words came. Because deep down, he knew the truth. He knew he had underestimated this family, not by blood, but by bond. And standing there, surrounded by men who carried loyalty like armor, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: fear of the right kind. The tension reached a breaking point as more townspeople gathered outside, drawn by whispers and the unmistakable presence of the Brotherhood. Mothers held their children close, shop owners stood with arms crossed, and teenagers watched wide-eyed from behind their parents. For years, Dalton had used fear to control this town, but now fear was slipping from his grasp like sand through fingers. In its place rose a collective courage, steady, growing, unstoppable. The kind of courage that appears only when people finally realize they're not alone. Inside the station, the young deputy stepped fully between Dalton and the group. It was a small gesture, subtle, but it shattered the sheriff's last illusion of authority. "We're opening an internal investigation," the deputy announced. His voice quivered at first, but grew stronger with each word. Dalton barked out a laugh, but it was hollow, desperate. "Over my dead," he began, but Bear cut him off gently. "No one wants that," he said. "We want the truth. Nothing more." The deputy signaled two others, and to Dalton's shock, they obeyed without hesitation. They approached him with uncertainty but determination, hands near their holsters but not reaching. Their message was clear: this ends now. The sheriff's face turned red with rage, then pale with the realization that he had lost the room, not to outsiders, but to the very men he thought he controlled. He stepped back, stumbling slightly. The badge on his chest no longer symbolized protection. It symbolized the lies he had hidden behind. The father watched it all unfold with a mix of relief and disbelief. He had walked into this station expecting resistance, hostility, maybe even danger. But instead, he witnessed justice being born in real time, fragile at first, then firm as more people stood on its side. He felt Bear's hand on his shoulder, steady and comforting. "You did right by your boy," Bear murmured. "You didn't stay silent. That's what real men do." The father swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the truth of those words. As the deputies moved to escort Dalton into the back office for questioning, the sheriff finally broke. "You don't understand who you're messing with," he spat in desperation. "I run this town." Bear stepped forward, meeting his gaze with a calm that cut deeper than any threat. "Not anymore," he said. And in that single moment, simple, quiet, undeniable, the balance of power shifted forever. The town, once ruled by fear, now stood firmly behind truth and the brotherhood that had refused to let injustice go unanswered. The sheriff's words echoed through the station, but their power dissolved instantly in the silence that followed. No one flinched. No one stepped back. The townspeople outside pressed closer to the glass, watching the man who had controlled their lives with intimidation now tremble under the weight of his own choices. The father stood in the center of it all, holding his son's photo like a shield of truth. He didn't yell, didn't rage. He simply held the evidence for everyone to see. That quiet strength struck deeper than any roar of anger could. For the first time, Dalton understood that he wasn't facing a single man. He was facing the consequences of every injustice he had committed. Bear took a slow step toward him, not threatening, not aggressive, but unshakably firm. "You used fear to keep people quiet," he said. "And maybe it worked for a long time. But fear dies the moment people stand together." Dalton swallowed hard, his hands twitching at his sides. He had used his badge as a weapon for years, but now that badge felt like a shackle. The bikers surrounding him remained still, their eyes steady, their posture composed, a wall of silent integrity, stronger than any badge he wore. One of the deputies cleared his throat, voice low but resolute. "Sheriff Dalton, you need to come with us." The words seemed to hang in the air, more powerful than handcuffs. The sheriff spun around, disbelief twisting his expression. "You're arresting me? Based on what?" The deputy didn't falter. "Based on evidence. Based on witness statements. Based on what's right." The sheriff let out a sharp, bitter laugh, but even he could hear the hollowness in it. He wasn't laughing at them. He was laughing at the sudden collapse of the world he once controlled. The father stepped forward, locking eyes with Dalton. There was no hatred in his gaze, only clarity. "You hit my boy," he said softly, "and you thought no one would care." Dalton looked away, unable to face the truth he had tried to bury. The father's voice grew steadier. "But people do care, more than you ever expected." The sheriff's shoulders sank, revelation settling over him like a slow, heavy rain. This confrontation wasn't about bikers versus law. It was about right versus wrong. And he finally realized he was on the wrong side, alone. As the deputies escorted him toward the back office, the townspeople outside erupted into murmurs of disbelief and cautious hope. Some covered their mouths. Others nodded, as if justice had finally found its long-lost way into the town. The bikers didn't cheer. They didn't gloat. They simply watched, steady and grounded, as the sheriff disappeared down the hallway. And when the door closed behind him, the entire atmosphere shifted, as though the building itself exhaled for the first time in years. Fear had been broken. The truth had taken its place. With Dalton finally removed from the room, the tension dissolved into a hum of relief. The father leaned against the counter, exhausted, the adrenaline that had carried him now draining away. Bear stepped to his side, offering a hand that was firm and reassuring. "It's done," Bear said quietly. "Your boy's safe now, and so is this town." The father nodded, swallowing the emotion swelling in his throat. For the first time since the assault, he felt like he could breathe, truly breathe, not because the danger was gone, but because he wasn't alone anymore. The young deputy who had stepped forward earlier approached the bikers with gratitude shining in his eyes. "I'm sorry it took this for something to change," he admitted. "He scared all of us." Bear rested a hand on the deputy's shoulder. "Fear is human," he said, "but choosing to do what's right, that's courage. And you showed it." The deputy lowered his head, humbled. He had just witnessed a group of men the town often misunderstood display more integrity in one night than the sheriff had shown in years. It changed him, reshaped him, ignited something new inside him. Outside, the bikers stepped onto the station steps as the crowd parted for them. A few people clapped quietly. Others simply stared with newfound respect. These men had arrived because a child had been hurt, and they stayed until justice took root. Their loyalty wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. The townspeople began seeing them not as rebels or outcasts, but as protectors, flawed, human, fierce, and grounded in a kind of honor that couldn't be bought or silenced. The father emerged moments later, carrying his son's photo against his chest. He looked at the bikers with a mix of gratitude and reverence. Before he could speak, Bear shook his head gently. "You don't owe us anything," he said. "We're brothers. That means something." The father blinked back tears. "You saved my boy's future," he replied. "I'll never forget that." The bikers exchanged glances, not prideful, but quietly moved. They didn't seek praise. They sought justice. And today, justice had finally stood tall. As engines began to rumble once more, the father watched the brotherhood prepare to leave. The sound didn't carry fear this time. It carried hope. It carried a message that echoed across the town. If one child is harmed, if one voice is silenced, if one soul is threatened, good men will rise. And when those men ride together, no badge, no corruption, no cruelty can stand against them. The road waited ahead, and the brotherhood moved forward, leaving behind a town forever changed by their presence, and a story that would be told for generations. The sun settled low in the sky as the bikers rolled out of the station parking lot, but they didn't leave town immediately. Instead, they rode together to the father's home, ensuring he and his son remained protected in case anyone loyal to the sheriff decided to retaliate. The boy stood on the porch, his small frame silhouetted against the warm light inside, clutching a blanket around his shoulders. When he heard the familiar rumble approaching, he smiled for the first time since the attack. The bikers slowed, giving him a respectful nod as they passed, a silent salute to a young survivor. The boy waved shyly, a gesture that softened even the hardest hearts among the men. Inside the house, the father set the sheriff's report next to the boy's untouched dinner from the night before. The contrast between the innocence of a child and the brutality of corruption made his chest tighten. He sat beside his son on the couch, pulling him gently into his arms. The boy leaned into him, trusting, safe, unaware of how close he had come to being silenced permanently. The father whispered promises, that no one would ever hurt him like that again, that he wasn't alone, that he had a family much larger than he ever realized. And each word carried the strength of the brotherhood behind it. Meanwhile, the bikers positioned themselves outside the house, forming a quiet vigil beneath the glow of streetlights. Some leaned against their bikes, arms crossed, scanning the road with unwavering vigilance. Others spoke softly in small groups, their voices low and steady. They laughed occasionally, small, tired laughs that broke through the tension. This wasn't a mission anymore. It was a moment of solidarity, of healing. They had come as fighters, but now they stood as guardians. Bear remained near the doorstep, speaking quietly with the father. He explained how the brotherhood had handled situations like this before, how they always supported their own, how they always protected the innocent, and how they would stay as long as necessary. The father listened, overwhelmed by the depth of their loyalty. "Why?" he asked softly, his voice cracking. "Why would you all do this?" Bear looked at him with steady eyes. "Because a child is a child," he said. "And when someone harms one, it becomes everyone's fight." As night settled deeper and stars dotted the sky, the atmosphere shifted. The fear that once hovered over the house dissolved into something else, something stronger. Unity, safety, brotherhood. The boy peeked through the window at the bikers outside, his gaze lingering on the patch on Bear's jacket. He didn't fully understand the meaning behind it yet, but he felt the truth of it. These men were here for him, and that feeling, more than anything, began to heal wounds far deeper than bruises. Hours passed, but no one left. The brotherhood remained stationed around the father's home until whispers rippled through the town. Deputies were conducting a full investigation inside the station, and Sheriff Dalton had been suspended pending charges. The news spread quickly, traveling through backyards, diners, and gas stations. For the first time in years, people walked outside with their heads higher, hope replacing fear. The father sat on the porch steps when Bear approached once more, removing his gloves as he sat beside him. "It's starting," Bear said quietly. "Real justice." The father exhaled a long, shaky breath, the weight of the entire ordeal finally easing. He looked down the road where the sheriff's patrol car once drove daily, a symbol of authority that had terrorized more than it protected. Now that symbol was cracked, exposed, and all because one child's voice had been believed. He thought no one would stand up to him. The father murmured. Bear nodded. Bullies always think that, until someone does. The two men sat in silence, the shared understanding between them deeper than words. Inside the house, the boy had fallen asleep, his breathing steady and peaceful. One of the bikers, a gentle giant named Rooster, peeked through the window to check on him. He smiled softly and whispered to the others, "Kids resting easy." The group relaxed a little more at those words. Their mission wasn't just about holding the sheriff accountable. It was about making sure this boy felt safe again, that he understood the world still had protectors, even when the ones who should have failed him. As the night grew quieter, Bear called the bikers into a loose circle on the lawn. They spoke about the next steps, supporting the boy through the legal process, standing with the father during court hearings, making sure the new leadership in the station didn't let the case disappear. Every man agreed without hesitation. This wasn't over. Justice didn't end with an arrest. It ended with change. And they were prepared to see it through, no matter how long it took. When dawn finally began to lighten the sky, painting the horizon in shades of gold and silver, the brotherhood prepared to leave. Engines grumbled to life one by one, deep and steady like a promise. The father stepped outside, holding his son in his arms as they watched the bikers line up in perfect formation. Bear looked back at them, raising 2 fingers in a quiet salute. The boy lifted his hand and mimicked the gesture, smiling softly. And with that, the Brotherhood rode off, not disappearing, but extending their protection across the town like a shield made of steel, loyalty, and unbreakable resolve. The father remained on the porch long after the last engine faded into the distance, holding his son close as the morning breeze whispered through the quiet streets. The town felt different now, lighter, more awake, as though bravery had swept through during the night and left a mark on every doorstep. Cars passed slowly, neighbors waved with newfound confidence, and whispers of what had happened spread like wildfire. Some people walked by with tears in their eyes. Others simply nodded at the father, acknowledging the silent strength he had shown. But every single person understood one thing. The sheriff's reign of fear was finally over. Inside the station, the investigation deepened. Deputies interviewed witnesses, examined reports, and uncovered years of misconduct hidden beneath Dalton's bravado. Files that had once been locked away were now in plain sight. And for the first time, the whistleblowers, officers who had quietly endured the sheriff's threats, spoke freely. Their testimonies painted a picture the town had long suspected but never dared confirm. Dalton hadn't been a protector. He had been a tyrant wearing a badge. And now, stripped of power, he sat in an interrogation room facing the truth he had spent years trying to hide. Meanwhile, the father took his son to a clinic in the next town for a full checkup. Doctors examined the boy with kindness, reassured him, and tended to every bruise with gentle hands. As the father thanked them, he couldn't help but think of how differently the sheriff had treated his child. The comparison burned, but it also brought a fierce sense of pride. His son had survived, not just physically, but emotionally. The boy clung to his father's shirt and asked softly, "Will the bad man come back?" The father knelt down, looked him in the eyes, and said, "No," because good people stopped him. On their way home, they passed the sheriff's station again. The building looked smaller now, no longer intimidating, no longer a fortress of corruption. Deputies worked inside with a renewed sense of duty, and townspeople stood outside, watching quietly as justice continued to unfold. The father paused the car for a moment, letting his son look out the window. "This place isn't scary anymore," he said softly. "It's changing." The boy nodded slowly, as though recognizing that the world, while flawed, still held goodness strong enough to fight back. Back at home, the father found a small envelope taped to the front door. Inside was a patch bearing the Brotherhood's emblem, and a simple note in Bear's handwriting. "He's family now. Anything he needs, we ride." The father closed his eyes, overwhelmed. It wasn't just a message. It was a shield, a lifetime promise, a declaration that his son would never again stand alone in the face of cruelty. He held the patch against his chest, tears of gratitude blurring his vision. And for the first time since the nightmare began, he felt something powerful settle deep within him. Peace. Life slowly returned to normal in the days that followed, but the town wasn't the same. It was better, stronger. People walked with renewed confidence, knowing that justice wasn't just a distant idea, but something that could be fought for and achieved. The story of a sheriff's downfall spread across state lines, shared in cafes, bars, roadside diners, and biker clubs. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others smiled knowingly, recognizing the pattern. Corruption rising, people uniting, justice winning. It was a story as old as time, but this version had a twist. A brotherhood riding in not for vengeance, but for truth. The boy healed quickly, his bruises fading to soft yellows before disappearing altogether. But the emotional marks healed, too, because he had seen good men rise for him. He had witnessed strength that protected rather than harmed. And he knew now, deep in his heart, that heroes didn't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wore leather and carried stories in their eyes. He kept the Brotherhood patch on his nightstand, touching it gently before bed each night, as though it were a symbol of safety woven into fabric. The father found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. At the grocery store, at work, even during quiet nights at home. Every moment reminded him of the turning point, the moment he chose not to stay silent, and the moment dozens of men chose to stand beside him without hesitation. It changed him. It showed him the power of speaking up, of trusting people, of believing that even in the darkest moments, there are still those who will stand up for what's right. He carried that lesson with him long after the bruises healed. One weekend, as the father and son spent time outside, the distant rumble of engines rolled across the wind. The boy's eyes lit up instantly, and he ran to the edge of the yard. Down the road came a line of familiar figures, the Brotherhood, riding slow and steady, their presence as comforting as the rising sun. Bear led the group, nodding respectfully as they approached the house. They didn't stop for long, just enough for the boy to see them, enough for the father to feel their support, enough to remind them all that the bond between them was unbroken. As the bikers continued down the road, their engines fading into the horizon, the father lifted his son into his arms. The boy rested his head on his father's shoulder and whispered, "They came back." The father smiled. "They always will," he said. And under that steady hum of truth, the story closed not with anger, nor with fear, but with something far stronger. The certainty that when good people stand together, justice isn't just possible, it's inevitable. The days that followed carried a quiet clarity, as if the town itself had taken a deep breath after years of holding it in. The truth had finally risen to the surface, not through force or chaos, but through unity, through men who refused to let silence become complicity. The father watched his son play again, watched him smile without fear, and understood that what the Brotherhood had given him was far greater than justice. They had given him the reassurance that even in a world filled with injustice, there are still those willing to rise and defend the innocent. That knowledge alone reshaped the way he viewed his own strength and the strength of the people around him. As he walked through the town, people greeted him with nods of recognition and gratitude, not because he had sought attention, but because he had stood up when it mattered most. He realized that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to fight for the truth, even when your voice trembles. And sometimes, courage rides beside you, wrapped in leather and brotherhood, roaring down the road to remind you that no one should stand alone in their darkest moment. That lesson would remain with him, etched deeply into his heart. Meanwhile, the boy healed in more ways than one. The bruises faded quickly, but the confidence returned even faster. He carried himself differently, not scared, not fragile, but assured, because he had seen something rare. He had seen his father fight for him, and he had seen strangers band together to protect him without asking for anything in return. That experience taught him a truth that many adults forget, that strength is not measured by force, but by the willingness to do what is right when no one else does. That memory would guide him for the rest of his life. And for the Brotherhood, life moved forward as it always had, on open roads beneath wide skies, with loyalty as their compass. They didn't wait for praise, nor did they want it. Their act of protection had come from a place deeper than recognition. It had come from principle, from the belief that a single child's safety outweighs fear, corruption, and the weight of any badge. Their engines echoed that message across every mile. When injustice rises, so will they. Not to dominate, but to defend. If this story moved you, let it remind you that justice is built not by the powerful, but by the brave. And bravery lives in all of us. If you want to continue witnessing stories that reveal the strength, loyalty, and humanity that still exist in this world, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and share your thoughts below. Your voice matters. And together, we can keep these stories alive, inspiring others to stand when it counts the most.